Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to work on part 2 of our motor build. In the last part we installed our bearings and seals into our center cases. Today we are going to work on getting our crankshaft installed, get our transmission installed, and then get the cases, 2 center cases put together. I have a set of Honda OEM gaskets here. I have a hot rods crank, and I have a crankshaft puller, a Tusk crankshaft puller that we're going to use for installing that. So we're going to go ahead and get started. The first thing is going to be to get the crank in. We're going to have to use the puller to pull that into place on this center half. Then once we have it installed, we will then be able to install the transmission, the shift forks, the shift drum, get all that in place. And then we'll be able to get the other half of the case pressed on. Using a puller is pretty important with this. As you can see, there is no support in that crankshaft in the middle, so you cannot safely put this into place and then put this on a press to press it in. You would end up throwing the trueness of the crankshaft off, creating a lot of vibration and issue. The best and safest way to put it in is to use a puller. There is you could freeze it and put the crankshaft in the freezer and see if that would shrink the metal enough to allow you to slide it in. I'm not sure if that would work. I've read that some people will do that. From the factory, these were an interference fit. They were made and designed by Honda to be a snug fit. So the puller is really the safest way to do that. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to make sure that my seal on the opposite side has some decent amount of grease in there so that there's no restriction as the end of the crankshaft slides through there. I'll probably put a slight layer of grease on the inside of this bearing race just to assist with the crankshaft sliding into place. And we'll get it set up with the puller and start putting that in. All right, we've got the crank starting to slide into the bearing. On this end, with the Tusk crank puller, we have an adapter that threads onto the end of the crank. You put this adapter underneath it, because that will then thread into this piece here. Well, I'm going to go ahead and put this down, thread that on. Okay, so that piece goes on. Then this piece here slides over top and will seat onto the flat surface on the crank here, on the case here. And then you put a nut on the top portion. And go ahead and you'll put a nut on the top portion here, and then you're going to basically spin the nut, and that will pull the crank into place. Obviously, as you're pulling it in, you got to be careful. You got to make sure that the connecting rod does not get jammed up or locked into a bad position here. You need to make sure that that will clear the case as well. So I'm going to go ahead and get the puller fully installed, and then we'll go ahead and get this crank put into place. Okay, we got the puller into place, and I snugged it up by hand, and even just snugging it up by hand actually pulled the crank in a lot farther than it was just before. So I'm going to put the camera down, and well, let me see, I should be able to, I'm going to try and position the camera so you can actually see. Let me go ahead and crank it into place. All right, once you're ready, the nut on the end of this Tusk puller is a 26 millimeter. Put a wrench on there. And it's an interference fit, so you should see a little bit of resistance, but it should not be so extreme that that you can't move it. As you can see, our crank is moving in there. And you will bring this in, and you'll know when the crank is fully seated, because just like when you're pressing in a bearing or anything of that nature, you'll feel it bottom out. We are just about there. You may have to hold on to the crank to keep the crank from spinning like mine just was. Obviously keep your connecting rod, again, clear. As you can see, we're just about ready to bottom out there. And there you go. And you'll feel it when it hits the end. And then we'll just loosen this nut off and back this off. Okay, we've got our puller removed. Crank moves nice and smooth. I'm going to go ahead and put it back in the assembly jig. Okay, crankshaft is in. Moves nice and smooth. Bearings move nice and smooth. You're going to hear it hit the housing a little bit there, or hit the case, I should say. But everything moves nice and smooth. All right, we've got our engine back in the stand. So next step is going to be to install our transmission. I'm going to put some lube on the seal back here for where the sprocket would go. I'm going to make sure I put some lube on these. So a little bit of assembly lube on the bearings. And then we're going to go ahead and insert the transmission. The transmission actually will be going in just literally in one piece, just like that. So we're going to go ahead and get that prepped and ready and get some lube on these, and then I'll show you how we stick that in. Okay, so I took the large gear off the end of our one main shaft. We're going to mesh these together. Makes it a little easier to grab the end by taking the large gear off. And then I'm going to work that in, keeping the gears lined up. Get this one lined up with the bearing. As soon as we're lined up with the bearing, we can tip that right over. And our transmission's in place. Okay, then we put this gear back on with both of its thrust washers and collar. We're all moving in there. Everything's nice and smooth. Okay, I'm going to move this back over to the other position so we can continue with assembly. Next is going to be the shift forks and the shift drum. Okay, next step is we're going to take our center shift fork. We're going to put that into the transmission here. Okay, and then we're going to take the pin and we're going to put the pin in, but we're not going to lock the pin into the case yet, because then we're going to bring our shift drum in. Start putting that in place, lift up just a little bit on that shift fork so that it drops into the center groove on the drum, and then you can lock the pin in place. And now our center fork is in place. Our center shift fork. Okay. Okay, next we're going to take the left shift fork. It's got the little L on there. And that's going to go down on the bottom here. Okay, and what you're going to do is we got to get that one up and into its groove. So we're going to take this, just lift that up a little bit. There we go. Had to use two fingers in there to push this. So this way I was pushing the pin into its groove, but you're using this pin to actually lift up once the fork gets into position. Then what we're going to do is we're going to just back it off, pull it out just a little bit so that it lines up with the hole where the pin goes. As you'll line it down, then you'll hold that there. Okay, so then next we're going to take the right shift fork I'm going to put that one into place. You're going to have to lift up on that one so that you can get the pin to go into the groove. And then you got to make sure that lined up. You'll be able to look right down them. Then you'll be able to put the pin in to lock both shift forks into the case. And there we are. Now everything's locked in, shift forks are in place, holding the gears where they are, everything's locked in with the drum. All right, so now that the transmission is in, I added a little extra lube to the end here. Made sure that the gears have something on them. Even though, yes, the crankcase is going to be full of oil back here, but these gears were cleaned in a parts cleaner, so you know, everything's pretty dry, even on the shaft. So I made sure that we had some lube on them. The next thing is I'm going to make sure the case half is prepped for the gasket. I've got the alignment dowels inserted. All right, and I put a little anti-seize on those just to make sure that they don't seize to the case. Makes it a little easier to remove them down the road. I have an OEM Honda gasket that we're going to put in. And I'm going to put a little bit of 3-bond 1211 on there, just a smear on both sides, just to make sure that we get, you know, this is an older case, even though these cases have been used before. You know, there may be some minor imperfections, so I figure a little bit of silicone smear on either side of the gasket will help make sure that we get a good solid seal. And then we'll put the other case half on, and same thing, then we use the puller to pull the other case half and pull it together, and then we'll be able to bolt it right up. All right, have just a very light layer, just a smear of 3-bond 1211 on this gasket, just in case there's any imperfections in the edge of the cases, just as insurance. So I'm going to go ahead and lay this on the case. Okay, got the gasket laying on there. So next step is I'm going to actually just put a smear. I'm going to put it directly on the case here and on the edges here, and then we're going to put this case half onto the top there. All right, got the sealant on the other case. Now we're going to set that down on the crank, on the other. Put the two case halves together. Looks like our biggest headache is going to be pulling down on that crank. So let me get the crank puller set up so that we can pull these cases together. Okay, so we have the crank puller in place. Now we're going to start to pull this together. You want to make sure that your connecting rod does not interfere at all or get in the way. You want to watch the case halves as you're pulling it together. Make sure that everything pulls down together evenly. If you see that the side where you're pulling down on the crank is pulling down more than this side, you could take a rubber mallet and just give it a little tap. There we go. You see how that just set down there? There we go. Okay, we are going down. our alignment dowels come together. Make sure the connecting rod's not in the way. See here all the stuff, the shift drum and everything is lining up, coming through. And as you can see, that case is starting to almost there. There you go. And you will feel it bottom out. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and remove the crank puller. Okay, crank puller is off. You want to make sure that your crankshaft spins nice and free, which it does. We got to trim this piece of gasket out, and actually these ones need to be trimmed flush with the top of the basically where the base of the cylinder would go. We're going to spin this around. Obviously, want to make sure your transmission's spinning smoothly as well. Everything's spinning smoothly there. I've got all my crankcase bolts here, so we're going to spin it around and insert all the crankcase bolts. Okay, we've got our crankcase bolts here. Our two longest ones are going to be right at the base of the cylinder here on the top. Our four shortest are going to be right all around the sprocket here and into the bottom. And these three middle ones are going to be right inside the stator area here. Two there, one down there. We're going to go ahead, I'm going to put a little anti-seize on all of them and go ahead and thread them in, and then they will get torqued to about 8 foot-pounds. All right, got the crankcase bolts in, snugged them up. Next thing we're going to do is put our counterbalancer bearing retainer in. We are going to do that because the two long bolts, this one and this one, go all the way through and will help make sure we pull that side of the crankcase, the two halves of the crankcase together there. So we have a new bearing and O-ring in here. I'm going to put a little grease on this bearing on the inside and put some dielectric grease on the O-ring. Then we'll slide that right in. We have to tap it in a little bit. All right, have our counterbalancer bearing retainer in. Okay, that took a little bit of a balancing act. Obviously, I lubed up the inside of it with some dielectric grease, but putting it in with that O-ring, it doesn't want to go in. When you start tapping it with a hammer, you got to be careful tapping it with a mallet. The bearing wants to pop out because it is not a real tight fit, or at least the bearing I have is not a real tight fit. So I basically put it into place and I started the bolts just to hold it in place. And then I took the back end of this, put it through the other side just to hold the bearing in place. Put a little pressure against it and then tapped it in. And it went right in. Very light tapping, and then was able to snug the bolts up. And as you can see, I guess it shears off what it doesn't need of that O-ring. So we are all set there. That is in. Now I'm going to get my torque wrench and we're going to go around and we're going to torque all these bolts to about 8 foot-pounds. Okay, I'm going to start torquing these bolts. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start in the middle here. And I'm not going to torque them fully. I'm going to torque it till it starts beeping, and then I'm going to go back around and take it to the full 8 pounds. I'm starting in these center ones, and then I'm going to work my way out. 8 pounds is not a lot of force, so doesn't take much. Okay, I'm going to torque all of them to 8 pounds, and I'll come back. All right, all bolts are torqued to 8 foot-pounds, and that completes it. Our center cases are now assembled. Crankshaft, transmission, all installed and moving smoothly. Our counterbalancer bearing retainer is installed. Already went around and wiped off any excess sealant that oozed out once we torqued everything down. And that's it today. Next video we're going to be doing, we'll go into the assembly of the clutch side of the motor, as well as we will get into another one with doing the installation of the stator and the flywheel. Well, I thank you very much for watching. I hope this helped anybody out there that's doing this. If you have any comments or suggestions, please feel free to leave them below. If you like what we're doing here, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much and have a great day.